If purification leads to peace, why does it begin with fire? This question reveals a paradox central to both psychology and spirituality. In modern culture, pain and struggle are interpreted as signs of dysfunction, something to avoid or medicate. Yet throughout the history of human development, discomfort has been the signal of transformation. Whether in emotional growth or scientific progress, change occurs only through friction when existing patterns are challenged. Al-Ghazali, the 11th century philosopher and moral psychologist, described this tension as the fire that refines the soul. He saw it not as punishment, but as a natural process, the heat generated when the lower self resists truth. In that resistance lies purification. The impurities of ego and illusion burn away, leaving behind a clarified awareness. In this lecture, we will examine how Al-Ghazali conceptualized this hidden fire, and how modern psychology and neuroscience now confirm his insights about self-discipline, emotional regulation, and cognitive transformation in today's world. The human being's relationship to discomfort has reversed. Every inconvenience, every unpleasant feeling is immediately anesthetized through screens, entertainment, food, or distraction. The assumption is that peace means the absence of discomfort, but neuroscience suggests the opposite. Emotional discomfort is a functional signal, the mind's way of indicating the need for reorganization. Studies on the amygdala and stress regulation show that avoiding discomfort strengthens fear circuits. This leads to low distress tolerance, an inability to remain present with difficult emotion, and cognitive avoidance, where the mind escapes into distraction rather than integration. As avoidance becomes habitual, emotional resilience declines. Al-Ghazali described this centuries earlier through the dynamics of the nafs, the lower self that resists correction. When the nafs amra dominates, the person becomes reactive, unable to endure the heat of moral confrontation. Every attempt to escape discomfort only deepens the cycle of agitation. In his view, the seeker's first encounter with the fire of self is inevitable because purification begins where avoidance ends. Abu Hamid al-Ghazali remains one of the most influential thinkers in Islamic philosophy and moral psychology. His monumental work, Ihya Ulum al-Din, the revival of the religious sciences, sought to unify theology, ethics, and human psychology long before these were recognized as separate disciplines. He treated purification, tahatskia, not as a mystical abstraction, but as a science of the soul, an organized study of how thought, desire, and will interact. The goal was alignment between three faculties, the intellect, the heart, and the will. When these are harmonized, consciousness becomes clear. When misaligned, it fragments into anxiety, pride, and confusion in modern terms. His model parallels cognitive, restructuring the reorganization of internal patterns through self-reflection and disciplined awareness. Al-Ghazali's purification, therefore, can be read as a method of psychological calibration, restoring balance through conscious engagement with discomfort rather than flight from it. Al-Ghazali begins with the most fundamental fire, self-confrontation. The greatest obstacle, he says, is not the external world, but the commanding self, the part of consciousness that rationalizes every impulse. When it is challenged, it resists, generating inner turbulence, guilt, shame, and emotional conflict. But this turbulence is not moral failure. It is psychological friction, the clash between higher awareness and ingrained patterns. Modern behavioral science supports this view. In cognitive behavioral therapy, Cognitive dissonance, the tension between one's beliefs and behavior, is understood as the precursor to change. When false beliefs are exposed, discomfort emerges, and the brain begins to reorganize its neural connections through neuroplasticity. Enduring that discomfort allows emotional circuits to recalibrate. Functional MRI studies show that confronting moral error activates the same brain regions as physical pain, particularly the anterior cingulate cortex, but that's sustained. Reflection builds new regulatory pathways in the prefrontal cortex. Thus, the fire of self-awareness is both biological and spiritual, a necessary energy that reshapes the architecture of the self. Without entering this fire, purification remains theoretical. The second fire Al-Ghazali identifies is the fire of intention. For him, every act derives its worth not from form but from purpose. Actions are lifeless forms, he wrote. Their soul is the intention. When intentions are fragmented, divided between ego, vanity, and conscience, consciousness burns in confusion. This internal heat is not chaos, but a diagnostic signal of misalignment. It exposes where attention and desire are in conflict. Modern neuroscience provides a fascinating parallel. Sustained intention reshapes the brain's attentional networks. Focused intention recruits the prefrontal cortex and suppresses impulsive activity in the limbic system, creating coherence between thought and behavior. Purification of intention, then, means ethical and neural alignment, a synchronization between what you value, what you think, and what you do. In psychological terms, this is the integration of goal-directed behavior with value-based motivation, the fire that tests intention. The repeated questioning of why behind each act refines sincerity. Through it, self-deception is exposed, and the individual's moral compass stabilizes. A third form of fire is detachment, the process by which the heart is freed from overdependence on external outcomes. Al-Ghazali observed that attachment to wealth, reputation, or pleasure darkens perception. The heart becomes reactive, oscillating with gain and loss. He defines Zud, often translated as renunciation, not as rejection of the world, but as recalibration, training the attention to prefer what is permanent over what is temporary. Modern neuroscience frames this in terms of the dopamine reward system. When expectations are unmet, the brain experiences reward, prediction, error, producing cycles of craving and frustration. Detachment reduces these fluctuations, stabilizing emotional tone. Research on mindfulness confirms Al-Ghazali's principle. When individuals observe their cravings without acting on them, neural activity in the ventral striatum decreases and emotional regulation improves. The fire of detachment, therefore, is the conscious endurance of desire without indulgence, allowing it to burn itself into clarity rather than chaos. This burning away of excess desire restores equilibrium between reason and passion, a condition Al-Ghazali called the balance of the soul, the fourth fire. According to Al-Ghazali's remembrance dhikr, contrary to superficial interpretation, dhikr is not repetitive recitation alone. It is the sustained training of attention upon the real. By focusing consciousness on a higher principle, the mind gradually rewires itself. In modern neuroscience, this corresponds to neuroplastic reinforcement, the strengthening of neural pathways through repeated focus. Just as physical exercise sculpts the body, repetition of sacred focus sculpts the brain's attentional system, functional imaging of meditative practitioners shows decreased activity in the default mode network, the system associated with mind-wandering and self-referential thought, and increased coherence in areas governing emotional stability. Al-Ghazali's fire of remembrance thus mirrors the mental effort of sustained attention. At first it feels strenuous, but over time it converts to calm clarity. The repetitive heat of focus burns away distraction and replaces it with continuous awareness. In his language, remembrance transforms forgetfulness into presence, the most refined stage of purification at this point. Al-Ghazali's metaphor of fire can be understood through a rational lens, almost as a law of spiritual thermodynamics. Fire symbolizes transmutation, energy released through the breakdown of form. Psychologically, it represents the conversion of raw emotion, fear, anger, desire, into insight and stability. Al-Ghazali's reasoning is systematic. Purification is not destruction but transformation. The same energy that fuels vice can become virtue when redirected. Anger becomes moral courage. Desire becomes aspiration. Fear becomes awareness of consequence. Modern neuroscience echoes this through the process of reappraisal. Emotional energy cannot be deleted, only neuroimaging shows that reframing an emotional experience does not suppress neural activation, it redirects it, converting distress into understanding. Hence, purification operates like a conservation law of the soul. Nothing is lost. Everything changes state. Pain precedes peace, because the same neural circuits that process suffering also generate meaning when engaged reflectively. The fire, therefore, is not divine punishment, but divine calibration, the heat through which internal chaos becomes coherence. To translate Al-Ghazali's wisdom into modern practice, we can view purification as a disciplined process of psychological mastery rather than moral idealism. Begin by recognizing inner turbulence as information, not failure. In cognitive therapy, this is called meta-awareness, observing thoughts without immediate reaction. Analyze the motive behind each emotion. Ask what attachment or fear gives rise to it. This corresponds to cognitive restructuring, identifying distorted patterns of thought. Channel the same emotional energy into purposeful action. Neuroscience calls this emotional reappraisal, converting reactive energy into adaptive behavior. Engage daily in attentional training, whether through dhikr, mindfulness, or reflective journaling. Repetition strengthens the prefrontal pathways responsible for self-control. Contemporary research by psychologists like James Gross confirms Al-Ghazali's framework. Emotional transformation arises not from suppression but from awareness and reappraisal. In this light, Al-Ghazali's fire is the process through which emotional chaos becomes ordered cognition. Purification is thus a rational discipline of attention, emotion, and moral coherence, a psychological architecture, rather than a mere religious ideal. The hidden fire that purifies every seeker is not a mystical metaphor, is the name Al-Ghazali gave to the rational process of correction. Whenever awareness confronts illusion, heat is produced, the friction between what is and what should be. Avoiding that heat preserves impurity. Enduring it restores harmony. Al-Ghazali's model bridges theology, philosophy, and cognitive science by showing that transformation is not annihilation but alignment. The restructuring of consciousness around truth in modern language. This means that peace is not the absence of disturbance, but the integration of all its elements into a coherent order. The purified soul is not emotionless. It is emotionally intelligent, capable of converting every feeling into understanding. Thus, the fire that once seemed threatening becomes the sign of life. And perhaps the ultimate question Al-Ghazali leaves us with is this: if purification feels like burning, could it be that your soul is simply returning to its original clarity?